Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a world where torchlight flickers against stone walls, the air smells faintly of damp hay and wood smoke, and you stand in the middle of a medieval courtyard where whispers of honor and bloodshed hang heavy in the cool night air. It's the perfect place to drift through stories of single combat, the craziest one-on-one fights history has preserved, or at least half remembered in scraps of parchment. Of course, you probably won't survive one of these duels yourself. Most ended with broken bones, dented armor, or a reputation ruined faster than a medieval pie left out in the sun. But don't worry, you only have to survive the story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing those comments, imagining someone in California at sunset, another in Germany with midnight tea, or someone in Australia waking up to knights in armor before breakfast. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cobbles beneath your boots feel uneven as you step into the hush of an imagined list field. Here in the dim glow, banners hang, each stitched with colors and beasts that tell stories of families you've never met but instantly feel connected to. The audience around you murmurs. Some lean in eager for justice, others hungry for spectacle. You know this isn't going to be a quiet game of chess. This is trial by combat, trial by nerves, and trial by whatever poor squire forgot to properly strap on a greave. The idea of facing another human one-on-one with everyone watching is both terrifying and theatrical. Medieval society treated it as proof that divine judgment would favor the righteous, though let's be honest, being taller, faster, and better fed probably helped too. You might think of it as a brutal sporting match, but imagine if the referee was God himself, sitting invisibly in the stands. No pressure. As you adjust to the atmosphere, you can almost feel the metallic tang of sweat on the air. You notice how spectators bet not just on who will win, but how many strokes it will take, or whether the loser's helmet will fly off dramatically. Yes, even then people wanted the highlight reel moment. Your mind drifts over the possibilities. In some fights, kings wagered nations' honor. In others, the quarrel was about insults, stolen land, or who had the best hat. Occasionally, as in Viking sagas, duels decided marriages, inheritance, or simply who was allowed to stand on a particular island. Imagine fighting to the death over beachfront property. Humans really have always known how to escalate. What makes all this compelling and sleepily soothing as you float through it is not the gore or violence, but the odd mixture of solemnity and absurdity. One man swings a battle axe with holy conviction, another trips in the mud. A chronicler swears angels favored the victor, though you suspect sheer clumsiness played its role. Historians still argue whether many of these accounts happened as described, or whether monks just spiced up their manuscripts to keep readers awake. Still, each duel has left an echo that rolls forward into our present moment. You'll find fragments carved into stone, painted on parchment, whispered into sagas, and now murmured to you in this late-night narration. You'll find yourself tracing not just swords and spears, but the fragile line between justice and entertainment, between faith and performance. And so you let the torches blur, the sound of clashing steel muffled as if through water, and settle deeper into this world where every heartbeat could decide the fate of lords or peasants alike. In the glow of imagination, the lists are endless, the combat eternal, and yet somehow safe when viewed from your pillow. The torches sputter in the damp night, and the crowd leans forward, sensing something monumental is about to happen. You find yourself stepping onto the rough grass of Bannockburn, June 1314, where two armies stare each other down. The Scottish host, ragged but determined, faces the glittering force of England under Edward II. Tension hums in the air like the twang of a drawn bowstring. And out of this frozen tableau, one man breaks ranks. Here comes Henry de Bohun, an English knight with his visor down, lance leveled, and pride swollen as large as his warhorse. He sees a smaller figure on a pony across the field, That's Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, not armored like a tourney knight, but still mounted, carrying only a battle axe. You can almost hear Bohun thinking, easy win, instant glory, let's go viral in 1314. Mainstream fact, the clash between Bohun and Bruce is one of the most famous single combats in medieval British history. Chroniclers tell us that Bohun lowered his lance, charged with full momentum, and missed his chance at immortality because Bruce swerved aside at the last second. In a flash, Bruce rose in his stirrups and swung his axe. One blow, that's all it took. His strike split Bohun's helmet, and the English knight crumpled before the watching armies. The Scots roared, the English groaned, and the psychological impact was immense. One man's mistake became the legend that lifted an army's morale. A quirky tidbit, chroniclers say Bruce's men were more upset that he broke his favorite battle axe than thrilled at his victory. Imagine the king casually brushing off nearly being impaled while fretting over snapped equipment. It's the medieval equivalent of winning a duel and then complaining that your phone screen cracked during the celebration. The field buzzed with disbelief. A single swing had tilted the weight of confidence. The English knights, who'd assumed their sheer numbers would overwhelm, suddenly had to reckon with the possibility that divine favor, or just Scottish stubbornness, wasn't on their side. Historians still argue whether Bruce actually faced real danger in that moment. Some suggest Bohun's lance never had a chance at full impact because of the uneven ground. Others think Bruce's armor would have saved him regardless, but in storytelling terms, none of that matters. What the crowd saw was their king riding back coolly to his men, shrugging as though he'd just swatted a fly. Picture yourself standing in that cheering throng. You'd be swept up in the frenzy, shouting until your throat burned, half from relief, half from awe. The moment would replay in your head all night. The charge, the sidestep, the devastating counter blow. If medieval TikTok existed, you'd loop it endlessly, captioned, "When you pick a fight with the wrong guy." The odd thing about these duels is how they mixed the sacred with the mundane. Chroniclers described Bruce's act as heaven's will, yet the Scots also complained about a broken axe. It's the sort of contradiction that defines medieval life. Fate decides battles, but also someone has to pay for the repairs. As you let the sounds of Bannockburn echo around you, the cheers, the clang of distant weapons, the nervous neigh of horses, you notice how the glow of victory lingers longer than the clash itself. A duel lasting seconds could ripple across years, turning into bedtime stories, ballads, and whispered encouragements around campfires. And so you drift from the field, the broken axe gleaming faintly in the torchlight of memory, carrying with you the lesson that sometimes survival comes not from brute strength, but from timing, calm nerves, and a swing that lands just right. You wander away from Scotland's damp field and step onto sun-baked earth, where banners ripple above a French tournament ground. The air smells faintly of sweat, horses, and roasted meat. Nobles crowd wooden stands, eager for spectacle. It's 1386, and in front of you unfolds what chroniclers call the last judicial duel sanctioned in France. This isn't casual jousting, this is life or death, with honor, property, and divine judgment on the line. The combatants, Jean de Carouge, a knight grim with determination, and Jacques Legris, once his friend, but now his sworn enemy. The accusation? De Carouge's wife claimed Legris assaulted her, and since medieval courts weren't exactly brimming with forensic evidence, the solution was simple. Let God decide through a duel. You probably wouldn't survive this legal system. Imagine every dispute from parking tickets to landlord problems solved by armored combat. Mainstream fact, the duel took place before King Charles VI in a massive crowd in Paris. Both men donned full-plate armor, mounted horses, and prepared for the ordeal. Chroniclers describe tense moments as the two thundered toward each other, lances shattering. Horses fell, men tumbled, and the melee shifted to swords, axes, and daggers. The quirky tidbit, According to one account, Carriages actually paused mid-fight to pray aloud, basically live-streaming his plea to heaven while everyone else held their breath. You can imagine the awkward silence, broken only by metal clanging and someone in the crowd probably muttering, "So, do we clap now?" Blades scraped, sparks flew, and finally Carriages pinned Legree and delivered the fatal thrust. The crowd erupted. Justice, or at least the version endorsed by Armor and Adrenaline, had been served. Carriages was celebrated, his wife's honor restored, and Legree condemned not only in life but in afterlife. Yet historians still argue whether Legree was actually guilty. Some believe he was framed, that medieval courts leaned more toward dramatic theater than careful truth. Others point to the wife's testimony and say the duel did exactly what the system intended, revealed divine judgment. Either way, both families lived with the consequences, while Paris got its bloody headline of the decade. You can feel the exhaustion of both men lingering in the dirt. Their breaths must have echoed inside helmets, harsh and desperate, while thousands stared. Imagine the heat, the crushing weight of plate, the blur of vision behind narrow eye slits. You, sitting in the stands, would probably nod off after 10 minutes, lulled by the rhythmic pounding of swords. Oddly enough, that's the one place where boring history lives. Inside events that terrified the participants but hypnotized the audience into something closer to a grim lullaby. The duel left a lasting impression on French law. Afterward, judicial combat fell increasingly out of favor, like an app nobody updates anymore. People realized that maybe courtroom drama should involve parchment and quills rather than sharpened steel. But for that one autumn afternoon, the fate of reputations rested on armored shoulders and the outcome of a single desperate fight. As you leave the Parisian lists behind, the echoes fade. The cries of heralds, the scrape of weapons, the gasps of nobles leaning forward in shock. You carry with you the uneasy truth that medieval justice often looked like staged entertainment, and sometimes entertainment disguised itself as justice. The sand drifts quietly again, the wooden stands empty, and you wander on, the duel's thunder subsiding into memory, as if the clash of swords were just another lullaby, strummed softly against the night. You drift eastward, the chill of Paris fading, and soon find yourself on the wide open steppes of Rousses, where dawn spreads pink light across endless grass. The year is 1380, and the air is heavy with silence before a storm. Two armies, Muscovite Russians on one side and the Mongol Tatar horde on the other, stand locked in stillness across Kulikovo Field. And before anyone moves, two champions step forward because apparently one-on-one combat makes the best pre-battle warm-up. On the Russian side rides a monk named Alexander Peresvet. Yes, a monk? You probably wouldn't survive this monastic order because instead of meditating with incense, these guys trained with swords and thought nothing of swapping psalms for spears. Opposite him is the fearsome Tatar warrior Temir Mirza, more famously called Chelubey. Both are dressed for war, their horses restless, their lances gleaming like sunbeams on steel. Mainstream historical fact: this duel was said to open the Battle of Kulikovo, a pivotal clash in the struggle between Russ's principalities and Mongol dominance. Chroniclers describe the two charging full tilt at one another, each lowering a lance for a single decisive blow. The impact was catastrophic. Both struck true, both warriors died, and both horses collapsed. The armies erupted in shock before surging into battle. Here's your quirky tidbit. Legend insists Peresvet didn't actually fall from his horse. Even mortally wounded, he supposedly remained upright in his saddle, slumping forward but not tumbling, while Chelubey toppled to the ground. The story paints him as so saintly that even death refused to knock him over. You can imagine some medieval hype man pointing dramatically and yelling, "See? Even gravity loves the monk." Of course, historians still argue whether this duel actually happened in the dramatic way it's told. Some suggest it's pure propaganda, a myth built centuries later to inspire Russian pride. Others claim there must have been some form of champion clash. though maybe not as cinematic as the chronicles report. Either way, it became part of the national epic, woven into poems and songs. You picture the silence right before the charge, the heavy pause, horses stamping, warriors muttering prayers under their breath, then the thundering hooves, the splintering crash of lances, the blur of dust. For a moment, time stops. You feel the vibration in the ground as if the entire earth holds its breath. When the dust clears, both champions are gone, yet their story remains told and retold until it becomes more than fact. It becomes identity. The duel symbolized more than personal courage. It represented the will of the Rus to resist domination, to stand proud even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's less about who technically won, and more about how both men became icons. You can almost hear medieval storytellers embellishing details, adding heroic flourishes until the fight sounded like something straight out of a bard's dream. And you, standing in that quiet aftershock, can't help but smirk. Imagine being a soldier waiting hours in line for your battle turn, only to watch your champion's big opener end in a scoreless draw. Talk about anticlimactic. You can almost hear one soldier mutter, "Well, that was inspiring," before shrugging and charging anyway. The field sways gently with tall grass now, long after the armies departed. Birds circle overhead and the duel lingers like an echo in the soil. It's less about the truth of what happened than about how people remembered it, how they stitched it into the larger fabric of defiance and faith. So you wander on, leaving Perisfed and Chelube forever locked in their simultaneous strike. Two riders frozen in eternal gallop. Their clash is less a historical footnote than a legend whispered across centuries, and it drifts into your mind as softly as a lullaby, keeping pace with the steady rhythm of your own steps. The step winds fade, and soon you find yourself surrounded by salt air and the cries of gulls. The ship's prow cuts through cold northern waters, carrying you not to a battlefield this time, but to a small rocky island. Here in the Norse world, duels aren't reserved for kings or holy battles. They're a regular part of settling grudges. Welcome to the Viking Holmgang. The name literally means island walk, and you quickly see why. Two fighters row to a tiny patch of land, or sometimes just stake out a square of ground, and prepare to fight it out. You'd probably not survive this tradition, since instead of talking through disputes or calling a lawyer, the Norse solution to "he insulted me" was "let's duel until one of us bleeds." Convenient and terrifying. Mainstream historical fact, Holmgang was a recognized legal custom across Viking society. If you accused someone of theft, slander, or cheating you out of land, the ultimate proof wasn't paperwork but combat. The winner's version of events became the truth. That's one way to keep your storytelling concise. But here comes your quirky tidbit. Sometimes people exploited Holmgang rules for pure mischief. Chronicles mention professional duelists, basically full-time bullies, who traveled around provoking fights just to win property. Imagine a medieval subscription service where you lose your farm once a month because an angry Viking insists your goat looked at him funny, and historians still argue whether these fights were genuinely to the death or more often stopped once blood was drawn. Some sagas suggest duels ended after first blood, while others describe gruesome endings. Like many traditions, the truth may depend on time, place, and how theatrical the fighters felt that day. Take the saga duel between Gunlager Serpent Tongue and Hrafen Onundarson. Both men fell in love with the same woman, Helga the Fair, whose nickname makes it sound like she just stepped out of a shampoo commercial. Their rivalry stretched over years, and in true Viking fashion, they finally resolved it with Holmgang. The sagas describe how they fought with swords, blows ringing out over the water. Both men ended up fatally wounded, and Helga's tragic story turned her into one of the most memorable women in saga literature. You picture the scene, gray waves lapping at the rocks, gulls wheeling overhead, the clang of steel echoing across the fjord. The island feels claustrophobic, nowhere to run, every strike deliberate. You feel the sea spray on your skin, the tang of salt in your throat as the duel drags on. Then silence. The fight is over, but the ripples spread through generations of storytelling, and in between these deadly clashes, you catch the humor. Imagine a Viking complaining, "Oh no, I lost my sheep in a duel. Guess I'll just challenge the neighbor over his sheep next week." It's a dangerous kind of recycling program, but at least it kept them entertained through those long winters. The sagas keep the duel alive, blurring fact with fiction. Did every insult really end with swordplay? Probably not. But the stories remind you how much medieval people valued honor, reputation, and the spectacle of a fight. Sometimes the duel mattered less than the tale told afterward, the version sung by skalds beside smoky firelight. You let the sound of waves fade, imagining the two fighters forever locked in a circle on that rocky island, their blades flashing like sparks in the northern dusk. And as you turn away, the echoes follow you, as steady as the roll of the tide, pulling you forward into the next strange corner of medieval combat. The gulls fade, the sea air quiets, and your feet land on damp, green earth again, this time in Norman England. The year feels heavier here, the landscape dotted with castles and quiet cloisters, and in the air lingers the sharp, nervous tension of trial by combat. This isn't some Viking grudge on a rock. This is law, a court case in armor. You step into the clearing and notice a wooden fence enclosing a patch of ground. This is the dueling arena, an official legal space where two men may fight to prove innocence or guilt. You probably wouldn't survive medieval justice because here, you don't just get cross-examined by lawyers, you get cross-sliced by your opponent's sword. Mainstream historical fact. In Norman England, trial by combat was a legitimate legal practice, introduced after the conquest of 1066. If two parties disputed land ownership, inheritance, or accusations of treason, they might demand combat. Victory meant God had chosen your side, which sounds holy but probably felt a lot like random chance to whoever got knocked out first. Here's your quirky tidbit. If someone was elderly or infirm, they could actually hire a substitute to fight for them. Imagine showing up to court with your champion, like bringing a personal gladiator to small claims court. Suddenly your case about that disputed cabbage patch just got serious. One of the most famous cases was that of Henry of Essex in the 12th century. He was accused of treason for supposedly dropping the royal standard during battle, a big no-no when your king expects unwavering loyalty. Henry accepted trial by combat, facing off against Robert de Montfort. The duel was brutal, and Henry was beaten. He nearly died but was spared execution, instead forced to live out his days in a monastery, probably wishing he'd just hired a good lawyer instead. And historians still argue whether these combats were always fatal. Some accounts describe one fighter yielding after a beating. Others suggest that death was the only acceptable conclusion. The reality might have shifted over time, depending on the severity of the accusation and the mood of the official supervising. You picture the field, damp earth churned by boots, nobles gathered around in their cloaks, peasants peeking from behind fences, everyone whispering wagers. A knight steps forward in gleaming mail, his opponent in dented armor both clutching heavy swords. The silence stretches, broken only by the ring of steel meeting steel as the duel begins. And as always, there's room for humor. Imagine the poor peasant dragged into court over a goat-stealing accusation, watching his wealthy opponent's fully armored champion stomp into the ring. He sighs, muttering, "Well, there goes my goat." Medieval justice didn't exactly lean in favor of the little guy. But for nobles, the duel carried weight. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about honor, divine judgment, and reputation. Win, and your name was cleansed. Lose, and your family might carry the stain for generations. It was high stakes, dressed in shining steel. You drift back from the ring as the crowd roars, the combatants circling. The clash feels both theatrical and deadly serious, a strange blend of law and blood sport. And as the dust rises, you realize these duels weren't just battles. They were courtroom dramas with swords, scripted not by lawyers, but by fate. The wooden fencing of Norman justice fades, and in its place rise hot winds and the shimmering glow of stone walls under a Middle Eastern sun. You've wandered into the age of the Crusades, where East meets West in both brutal war and occasional, oddly theatrical one-on-one contests. This isn't about courtroom duels anymore. This is about spectacle, honor, and a bit of battlefield pageantry. You stand on a ridge overlooking two camps, Crusader knights with their banners stitched with crosses, and Muslim warriors whose standards ripple in the wind. The armies glare at each other across a dusty plain, but before the clash begins, champions sometimes step forward. You probably wouldn't survive these desert battlefields, not because of a sword thrust, but because the heat alone would knock you flat before the fight even started. Mainstream historical fact. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it wasn't unusual for leaders on both sides of the Crusades to permit or even encourage champion duels. These single combats served as tests of morale and divine favor, sending a message before armies fully engaged. Sometimes they were formal challenges, sometimes they just happened spontaneously when two warriors spotted each other and decided it was time to settle things in the most dramatic way possible. Quirky tidbit? Chronicles tell of Crusader knights who enjoyed such fights so much they treated them almost like sports. One account even describes knights sending messages back and forth like, "Meet me at that stream tomorrow, we'll duel after breakfast." It sounds less like a holy war and more like a medieval pickup game. And historians still argue whether some of the most colorful tales are real or heavily embroidered. For example, stories of Richard the Lionheart dueling great Muslim champions one-on-one are often exaggerated or outright fabricated by later writers who loved turning him into a superhero. Did Richard actually face single duels? Or did chroniclers just want their king to sound cooler at bedtime? The debate continues. You imagine the dust swirling as two riders approach each other, horses steaming, armor glinting like mirrors, lances lowering in the dry wind. Both sides of the battlefield hold their breath, soldiers craning their necks to see. Then the charge, the thunder of hooves echoing against stone hills, and the sudden shattering of wood and shield. The crowd erupts in a roar as if the entire war had been decided in that one strike. Sometimes these duels changed nothing militarily, but they mattered psychologically. A victorious champion could lift spirits across the camp, while a fallen one could dampen courage before the real fighting even began. It was part morale boost, part public relations stunt, and part ritual of honor. And there's humor in the mix too. Picture two exhausted knights pausing mid-combat, sweating buckets under the desert sun, muttering, "Can we just call this one a draw and grab some water?" Medieval accounts rarely record that kind of honesty, but you know someone must have thought it. The Crusader camps echo with whispers of these fights, half truth, half myth. Some are preserved in glowing detail, others probably invented by chroniclers to spice up an otherwise dull siege report. But to the soldiers listening at night around smoky fires, these stories gave shape to their fears and hopes. A duel wasn't just two men clashing. It was the entire war condensed into a single strike. You drift from the dust and heat, the roar of soldiers softening into murmurs. The champions fade into legend behind you, their lances forever colliding in a blur of sunlight and sand, leaving only the memory of spectacle as you step quietly onward. The heat of the Crusader plains cools, replaced by the polished gleam of banners and the chatter of nobles. You're no longer in the dust of battle, but inside a carefully staged theater of chivalry. The late medieval tournament ground. Here, single combat isn't law or desperate survival. It's spectacle. It's rehearsed pageantry with all the pomp of a Broadway show, minus the catchy songs and plus the risk of losing teeth. You stroll through a tournament field, the grass trampled flat by horses, wooden stands filled with cheering crowds. Ladies in elaborate dresses wave kerchiefs, knights adjust their plumes, and heralds shout names with all the flair of hype men at a boxing match. You probably wouldn't survive this event, not because of the swords, but because sitting all day in that crowd without sunscreen or a hot dog stand would be its own kind of medieval torture. Mainstream historical fact. By the 15th century, the pas d'armes, a kind of staged challenge, became popular across Europe. Knights would declare a symbolic location, like a bridge or a meadow, and challenge all comers to face them in combat. Sometimes it was tied to honor, sometimes to celebration, and sometimes, frankly, just for the fun of flexing martial skill. Quirky tidbit. Knights occasionally gave out trinkets or symbolic tokens to participants, things like garters, brooches, or little chains. It's almost like collecting stamps in a loyalty program, except instead of free coffee after 10 visits, you just earned more bruises. And historians still argue whether tournaments were primarily training exercises for war, or whether by this period they had drifted into pure entertainment. On one hand, jousts and single combat certainly honed weapon skills. On the other, the elaborate costumes, scripted entrances, and poetic dedications to ladies sound a lot like proto-theater. Picture the pas d'armes at the Passage of the Fountain in 1449. A group of knights defended a fountain decorated with gold and silver trinkets. Anyone who wanted to pass had to joust them, the whole thing recorded in florid detail. Was it serious training or just a medieval Renaissance fair with higher stakes? Probably a bit of both. The duel, in this context, wasn't about legal guilt or divine will. It was about honor, image, and putting on a good show. You imagine knights strutting like peacocks, their armor polished so bright it blinds the audience. Each strike meant to impress the crowd as much as defeat the opponent. And somewhere in the stands, a bored merchant probably muttered, another lance snapped, big deal. Wake me when someone does a backflip. Because even in the Middle Ages, audiences wanted spectacle, not repetition. These single combats and tournaments became part of the social fabric, celebrated in songs and chronicles. Winning a pas d'armes could earn you renown across courts, while losing wasn't the end of the world. It was all part of the performance. Think less life or death, and more got roasted in front of your crush. Painful, but survivable. You leave the tournament ground with the roar of applause echoing in your ears. The air is perfumed with trampled grass and spilled wine, and behind you, knights keep circling in carefully rehearsed challenges. The memory fades like a stage curtain falling at the end of a play, leaving you to wander forward into stranger corners of medieval dueling. The laughter and pageantry of the tournament dissolve, and you find yourself on a quieter street, the mood more hushed, almost secretive. Here, the clash of steel isn't between two men in shining armor, it's between a man and a woman. Rare, yes, but the Middle Ages had room for surprises, and occasionally women took to the list themselves. You probably wouldn't survive this social twist because even just raising your voice out of turn could get you scolded, let alone demanding a duel. Mainstream historical fact. There are scattered records of women participating in judicial duels, especially in Germany. Law codes like the Sachsenspiegel describe specific rules for such contests. If a man and a woman fought, the man was placed waist-deep in a pit given a club, while the woman was allowed to move freely with a sling or weight. The idea was to level the field, though it mostly made things look like a bizarre medieval game show. Quirky tidbit. In one account from Bern in 1288, a woman fought her husband in such a duel, she actually won, supposedly beating him to death with a rock, tied in cloth, while he flailed helplessly in the pit. Imagine the medieval gossip circle afterward. Did you hear about Martha? Really showed her husband who runs the household. And historians still argue whether these cases were frequent realities or rare legal curiosities. Some believe most recorded examples were symbolic or exaggerated, preserved precisely because they were so unusual. Others argue the rules were written down because duels like this actually happened often enough to need regulation. You picture the scene vividly. A ring of spectators leaning in, eyes wide with scandalous fascination. The man, stuck in his awkward hole, swings desperately at the woman circling around him. She spins the sling, stone whistling through the air. The crowd gasps, torn between laughter and shock. It's part justice, part public spectacle, and entirely unforgettable. Of course, not all female duels were marital disputes. Sometimes women acted as champions for family honor, stepping in when no male relative was available. In other cases, they fought in disguise, passing themselves off as men until discovery. An early example of breaking gender roles with sword in hand. And because medieval people loved drama, these rare duels made their way into legend. The stories carried moral lessons, warnings, or simply juicy entertainment. You can almost hear a tavern bard retelling it with extra flourishes. She struck him down with a single swing, and the crowd roared so loud the rafters shook. Humor lingers too. Imagine a medieval lawyer trying to keep a straight face while explaining the pit rule to the jury. Yes, Your Honor, waist deep in the ground, perfectly fair. It's the kind of rule that makes you wonder if medieval lawmakers ever stopped to ask, wait, does this actually make sense? You step away from the imagined pit, leaving behind the whispers and gasps of that scandalous duel. The image lingers, of a woman gripping her sling, of a crowd watching something they'd tell stories about for years. It's one of those rare medieval moments where the ordinary script of society flips upside down, if only for a heartbeat. The scandalous whispers of that pit duel fade, and now you find yourself in the calm of an armory, rows of swords, lances, axes, and gleaming suits of armor catching the light from narrow windows. Here the story slows down to look at the mechanics, the rules, the weapons, the tricks of equipment that shaped every single combat encounter. You probably wouldn't survive this place either, because even just trying on one of those helmets would give you a stiff neck for life. Mainstream historical fact: by the late Middle Ages, duels, whether judicial or ceremonial, were governed by strict sets of rules. Fights often began with lances on horseback, then continued on foot with swords, maces, or axes. If weapons broke, combatants might pull out daggers, known as misericordes, designed to slip between armor plates. The duel ended with surrender, death, or sometimes the intervention of officials if the fight dragged on. Quirky tidbit: some duels used deliberately odd weapon pairings. A knight might be forced to fight with a shield and club instead of his preferred sword, just to test adaptability. There are even accounts of duels fought with farm tools or staves, making the whole thing feel like a cross between lethal combat and improv theater. And historians still argue whether armor truly made fighters invincible or whether it only gave the illusion of safety. Some records suggest knights could withstand blow after blow thanks to their plate armor, while others describe duels ending quickly once someone managed to trip or pin their opponent. Was armor a fortress or just a heavy inconvenience? You picture the scene: two knights facing off in full harness, swords flashing as steel rings against steel. Sparks fly with each blow, but the armor holds. Breath fogs inside helmets, sweat drips into padded linings. At some point, the fight shifts from elegant swordplay to desperate grappling, pushing, tripping, trying to find that tiny gap in the plates where a misericord can slip through. And then there are the rules. Some duels banned thrusting, others insisted on specific weapons, and many required seconds and officials to oversee fairness. It sounds almost civilized until you remember the goal was still, ultimately, to prove guilt, honor, or dominance with violence. Humor sneaks in too. Imagine a knight pausing mid-duel because his visor got stuck, calling out muffled complaints while his opponent awkwardly waits. Or the poor squire whose job is to polish armor so bright it blinds the other guy. Medieval combat had its grand seriousness, but it also had plenty of slapstick moments no chronicle cared to record. The weapons themselves tell their own stories. A lance shattered in splinters might end the mounted phase in seconds. A sword dulled against armor might force combatants to flip it around and use the crossguard as a hammer. And always, tucked at the hip, that thin misericord, literally the mercy giver, waiting for the final strike. The irony of a mercy dagger that ended lives isn't lost on you. You leave the armory with the faint echo of clashing steel in your ears, imagining the endless variety of duels shaped not just by courage, but by the quirks of weapons and the written or unwritten rules that turned combat into both ritual and chaos. You step out of that armory of rules and gear, and almost immediately the air around you feels stranger, lighter, as though you've wandered into a gallery of stories that were too bizarre, even for chroniclers to tell straight. Here we gather the weirdest, most wonderful duel accounts that slip through the cracks of serious medieval history, moments where combat spilled into theater, wagers, and even straight-up absurdity. A mainstream historical fact first, medieval Europe treated dueling not only as justice or warfare, but also as a form of public entertainment. Nobles wagered on outcomes, crowds gathered in arenas, and chroniclers recorded events with a flair that sometimes makes you wonder whether they were writing history or bedtime gossip. A duel wasn't just combat. It was a performance, often embellished with flourishes and outrageous details. Take, for example, the duel where the weapons were specified as clubs, each man carrying a wooden cudgel thicker than your wrist. Onlookers described it as more of a comedy act than a fight, since armor made blows bounce and the men ended up panting, circling, and occasionally whacking helmets with a hollow clong that probably sounded funnier than it looked intimidating. Quirky tidbit. There are reports of duels fought under bizarre stipulations like fighting while standing in barrels or fighting while mounted on barrels being rolled downhill. Imagine training your whole life with a sword, only to be told, sorry, today you'll be jousting on top of a cask of ale. And yet people did it, often to settle wagers or just to put on a show, and historians still argue whether certain duels ever really happened or were pure invention. One story tells of a duel involving mounted warriors who brought animals into the fight, like elephants or camels, as a kind of medieval stunt show. Chroniclers recorded it, but the details are so over the top that modern scholars debate whether it's allegory, satire, or simply medieval fan fiction. Picture another oddity, a swimming duel. Two men stripped down, took to a river, and fought with daggers in the water, splashing around like medieval synchronized swimmers gone terribly wrong. It sounds absurd, but the point was simple. You fought however and wherever your opponent demanded, even if that meant trying not to drown while still stabbing. And then wagers. Nobles loved to bet on duels. Money, land, or even entire manors could change hands depending on who toppled whom. In some fringe tales, people bet outrageous objects, a favorite hunting falcon, a prized tapestry, or even their own mustache. Yes, apparently losing your beard or mustache in a duel settlement was a thing. You can almost hear a medieval crowd jeering, "Nice chin, my lord." Of course, the strangest duels blur the line between honor and spectacle. Imagine knights agreeing to fight dressed in absurd costumes, jesters' bells jingling as swords clashed, because their patrons thought it would be hilarious. Or duels fought at night by torchlight, not for fairness, but for dramatic effect. You can't help but think medieval society invented its own version of reality TV centuries early. And through all this weirdness, there's the reminder that even odd duels carried serious stakes. Someone's honor, property, or legal case was on the line. Beneath the theatrics, each story carries the pulse of real tension, though retold now with enough absurdity to make you smile before drifting back towards sleep. You move from the carnival of bizarre duels into the quieter, dustier halls, where scribes hunched over parchment, quills scratching by candlelight. Every clash you've just imagined only survives because someone chose to write it down. And, inconveniently, they often had their own agendas. It's in these manuscripts that you realize how tricky it is to separate sword-swinging reality from medieval marketing. A mainstream fact, most of our accounts of one-on-one fights come from chroniclers like Froissart or from court documents tied to trials by combat. These sources were not neutral record keepers. They often worked for patrons who wanted their side to look brave, noble, or at least less ridiculous than the other guy. When Robert the Bruce's axe took down Henry de Bohun, it was preserved in patriotic prose, complete with dramatic flair. Did it really happen just like that? Hard to say, but Scotland's national pride demanded a tale that rang with heroism. Quirky tidbit: some monks who were supposed to be far removed from the clamor of swords actually delighted in spicing up duel stories with vivid exaggeration. There's a manuscript margin doodle showing knights whacking each other like stick figures, almost cartoonish, as if the monk couldn't resist illustrating the chaos. Imagine being the scribe, meant to copy psalms, and instead you're sketching a knight toppling headfirst into a barrel. And historians still argue whether certain duel descriptions were propaganda more than reportage. Take the judicial duel of Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, so famous it inspired plays centuries later. Was Legris really guilty of assault, or was the duel less about truth and more about satisfying political power plays? Chroniclers lean toward the side of whoever paid their bread and wine. Bias also appears in silence. Many duels, especially those involving commoners or women, went unrecorded or were mentioned only in passing. What we have instead are grand narratives about kings and nobles, carefully edited to reinforce social order. You don't often find tales of two village bakers dueling with rolling pins, though that probably happened and would have made delightful bedtime reading. You picture a scholar in the present, peering at faded ink, trying to decide if a duel involving swimming combat was metaphorical for floundering in sin, or an actual river knife fight. The lines between myth, allegory, and history blur so easily that sometimes it feels like duels existed half in reality and half in legend, balanced like knights on a tilting log. And here's the fun thought. While you're drowsing now, the very fact you can imagine torchlit duels or barrel jousts is thanks to those scribes who couldn't resist putting quill to parchment. Without them, the medieval one-on-one would have vanished into silence, leaving only the echo of swords on helmets forever unrecorded. The ink-stained pages you just wandered through spill you into a wider circle, where the consequences of those duels ripple far beyond the tilt yard or battlefield. A single fight between two men could tip the balance of politics, sway entire families' fortunes, or shift how a kingdom thought about honor itself. You feel the weight of that, how one sword stroke could ripple like a pebble dropped into a medieval pond. Take the last duel again. Jean de Carouge's victory not only ended with Legris dead, but secured Marguerite's honor and for a while boosted Carouge's reputation. Yet reputations were fragile. A victory could make you look divinely favored. A loss could brand you guilty, dishonorable, or cursed. Imagine rolling into work today, losing at office foosball, and suddenly being exiled to a monastery. Workplace competitions were a little higher stakes back then. Mainstream fact, judicial duels were embedded in legal frameworks. They weren't just personal squabbles. The crown or court often sanctioned them. Winning wasn't just survival, it was a legal verdict. That meant land claims, inheritances, and reputations were literally on the line. Quirky tidbit, some nobles staged duels partly as PR campaigns. Chroniclers describe lavish pre-duel banquets where participants feasted in style as if preparing for a mix of battle and dinner theater. One knight supposedly paraded in wearing an entire coat of armor painted like a chessboard, because nothing screams, "Take me seriously," like looking like a walking rook. And historians still argue whether these spectacles genuinely resolved disputes or if they just escalated tensions. Did duels bring closure or sow more grudges? Some records hint that the families of the losing side often simmered for generations, seeking revenge. Honor wasn't neatly patched up by a single fight. It sometimes frayed even more. The ripple effects also ran upward. A king who allowed or denied a duel sent messages about his authority. If he sanctioned one, it showed faith in divine judgment. If he blocked one, it hinted at shifting toward rational written law. The duel wasn't just between combatants, it was a tug-of-war between tradition and reform. And for ordinary folk watching, these duels became moral theater. When Robert the Bruce cleaved Henry de Bohun, it wasn't just a Scottish knight beating an English one. It was the underdog kingdom flexing muscle. People took it as a sign of divine favor, a story to tell by firelight for generations. In short, these fights were the medieval version of viral content. As you settle back, you can sense how duels were never just about blades crossing. They were about honor codified into law, politics paraded in armor, and whole communities watching their fate mirrored in two figures standing across a field. The personal became public, and the echoes lingered long after the dust of the duel settled. From the ripple effects you drift onward, and the clang of swords begins to soften, fading into a quieter shift in the rhythm of medieval life. For centuries, duels had been the courtroom drama, the sports match, and the divine lottery ticket rolled into one. But by the late Middle Ages, the appetite for trial by combat waned. Slowly, the stage cleared, and you can almost hear the squeak of quills and rustle of parchment replacing the clamor of lances. Mainstream fact, the decline of judicial duels came through legal reforms. Monarchs like Louis IX of France preferred written evidence and sworn testimony to settling disputes with sharpened steel. He famously outlawed trial by combat in his domains in the mid-13th century, nudging society toward a more bureaucratic, less bloody path to justice. Quirky tidbits, some towns still clung to the spectacle. Records hint at absurd last-gasp duels, like one staged between two old men who could barely lift their weapons, closer to a slapstick play than a clash of warriors. Imagine sitting down expecting a life-or-death struggle, and instead watching two guys in chainmail wheeze at each other like broken accordions. And historians still argue whether religion or practicality played the bigger role in the duel's demise. Was it moral reform, with church leaders scolding that God had better ways of showing truth than sword fights? Or was it practical, with rulers realizing that duels disrupted order, wasted manpower, and risked embarrassing noble houses? The records don't give one neat answer. Another factor, warfare itself evolved. Gunpowder, longbows, and mass armies mattered more than individual heroics. A knight could win the grandest duel of his life and then be flattened by a cannonball 30 minutes later. Kind of ruins the whole God chose me narrative, and so duels became more theatrical than judicial. Padarmas and tournaments lingered, but they were entertainment and training grounds, not verdicts of guilt or innocence. You picture the medieval equivalent of reality TV losing viewers as audiences turned to new forms of drama, courts, chronicles, and eventually plays and novels. Yet the memory of duels lingered, preserved in stories and whispered nostalgically by those who liked the old ways. You sense that paradox. Societies move on, yet the romantic image of two figures meeting alone in a field endures, glowing faintly even in decline. The clang of steel and roar of crowds drift further away now, softening into memory, leaving you with a gentler hush, like mist spreading across a meadow at dawn. You've followed knights, monks, scribes, and rulers through their duels, seen the flash of axes, the stubborn tilt of lances, and the stubborn pride of men who thought God himself leaned over their shoulder during combat. But now, as the story slows, you can let those echoes dissolve into the background. You think of Robert the Bruce raising his axe, Jean de Carouge riding forward, every eye fixed on him, Viking champions meeting on narrow islands, monks doodling knights and margins because they couldn't resist. Each scene has had its own texture, loud or absurd or solemn, and yet they all feel strangely distant, like old campfire sparks, floating up and vanishing into night. Even the debates, the scholars squinting at chronicles, the arguments over truth and myth, begin to blur together, You no longer need to decide whether a duel really happened exactly as described. The uncertainty is part of the lullaby, like waves repeating on a shore. Historians still argue, but you don't need to. You can just let the questions settle into silence. The air grows slower, thicker. The torchlight that lit your way through the lists dims to candle glow, then fades to embers. The fields of battle empty, leaving nothing but soft grass beneath your feet. You breathe easier now, as though armor has slipped away from your shoulders, replaced by a blanket's weight. Every clang, every cheer, every pompous herald's cry. Quiet now. What remains is only a steady hum, like the fan you turned on earlier, soft and constant. You drift with it. The stories may have been fierce, even absurd, but they close gently in your mind. You're safe, you're still, and you can let go. The duels are done, but the calm is yours to keep.